All right, so I'm Nelson Petracek. We're going to spend the next 30 minutes talking about blockchain. I'm not going to teach you how to make a fortune trading Bitcoin, those kinds of things. That's not what this session is about. I've gotten that response before as well. So actually today we're not even going to talk about cryptocurrencies. We're going to talk about blockchain. We're going to talk about some of the underlying concepts behind it, but we're going to look at use cases outside of your cryptocurrency space. So we're going to talk a little bit about use cases around supply chain, pharmaceuticals. We're also going to look at what organizations need to consider when adopting a blockchain technology. All right, so how many people here working with blockchain technologies, kicking off POCs, those kinds of things? Okay, so we got a couple. How many people here familiar with some of the concepts, terms, technology? Okay, so most. All right, good. All right, now you know that you're important when even Dilbert starts making jokes about technology, right? So in this case, we can actually get the difference of the color in terms of blockchain technology, but it definitely has a lot of interest. I would say in the last, really in the last year, maybe 18 months, is when a lot of the conversations that I have with a lot of our customers, a lot of those conversations are now involving blockchain technology. What is it? Where can I use it? What are some of these technologies? Some of this stuff has been around for quite some time. Why is blockchain even different? Right? I had the notion of distributed ledgers, peer-to-peer networking, those kinds of things. I've had that for years. Why is this different? So a lot of those conversations are really around how does this fit and why does it apply and why should I be thinking about it? So even the analysts are talking a lot about blockchain technology. So they're talking about how it's going to grow. They're talking about use cases. They're talking about it in the context of being able to change dramatically the way in which organizations do business. Right? So it's got the attention of the analysts. It's got the attention of Dilbert. It also has the attention of people on Google. So when you look at some of the trends, and I just for fun took a look at some of the Google trends around blockchain, machine learning, IoT, those kinds of things. Machine learning and blockchain are really neck and neck when you look at how people are searching for these particular technologies. IoT kind of tapered off, which I actually found kind of interesting. I thought IoT had a little bit more interest, a little more hype. Maybe we know everything about IoT and so nobody's searching for it anymore, I'm not sure. But what really gets interesting is the combination of blockchain and IoT. That would be more relevant. So definitely a lot of interest, but why? So I usually break it down into a number of different categories, right? There is this push towards what the analysts will call the digital mesh. And so they'll talk a lot about the blending together of people, devices, content, and services, right? It's a much more seamless blend. There's much closer interaction. The boundaries between people and machines are blurring. And so when you look at that, there's this notion of a digital mesh. And a digital mesh really requires us to think about the way in we do business differently. I need new business models to be able to accommodate this type of interaction. And so a lot of those business models then lead to this notion of decentralized business networks. So previously, I would have some transactions, and I would submit these transactions to a clearinghouse, and 3 days later, those transactions would be cleared, funds would potentially be released, and other organizations would be brought up to date, maybe within a week. Right? That no longer can be held true. Right? That is not going to be fast enough. I call that decision latency. But the time in which it actually takes to process these events, these transactions, these data elements that are being distributed to multiple parties, I can't run those through an intermediary third party, through a clearinghouse. Right? So now you're starting to get this notion of decentralized business networks. So the way in which participants in this business network are going to exchange data, that is going to be done differently. I can't depend on a third party to provide that kind of trust. Right? So I would trust that third party, and everything that would go through that third party, I could deem it to be valid. If that third party has to go away because of the way I need to think about business now, how do I bring trust back into this network? And that leads us into the third item, which is this need for integrity, visibility, security. Right? I still need those things, and in fact, I probably need them more now than I would have if I had these intermediary third parties. In the case of IoT devices, how do I trust that that IoT device is allowed to talk to my network? In the case of payers and providers in the healthcare space, how do I make sure that the right things are happening between those two parties? Right? There's a big need for integrity, visibility, trust, auditability, immutability, and even auditing, right, when it comes down to how I'm going to exchange transactions. So these are really a lot of the drivers, if you will, behind the use cases where people are looking at blockchain technology. There's others. We're technologists. It's also fun. But from a business standpoint, right, this is where it applies. So then you look at some of the core concepts, and normally I have a demonstration that I will run through where I've got Hyperledger Fabric installed on Docker, and we run through some use cases with some chain code and that kind of stuff. We've actually got a separate meetup. We're in Denver as part of the TIBCO Denver meetup community where people can come in and actually do that. But for now, we're just going to talk at a higher level about some of the technologies. So first of all, of course, is this notion of a distributed system of record. So I'm going to take my data, distribute it over a peer-to-peer network, distributed ledger technology, so that everybody in essence has a copy. Right, now that's loosely speaking. Some of the new blockchain technologies allow you to partition your ledger depending on who you are and how you joined, but loosely speaking, everybody's going to have a copy of all the transactions that I've put into the blockchain layer. And I'm going to use blockchain as kind of like an umbrella term. Technically speaking, there's arguments around what part is actually the blockchain, what is a DLT, and that sort of thing. I'm just going to kind of use it as an umbrella term to cover everything, just for simplicity. Embedded business terms. There's a lot of conversation around, well, the real business value is not necessarily around just the transactions, but in my ability to automate those transactions and include business logic in my blockchain technology. And so we'll talk about that. These are the smart contracts that you've all would have heard about, but those are really a very, very key component, especially in how you adopt it at the enterprise level or from a permission blockchain level. You need security, verifiability, provenance, all those kinds of things, and then consensus and agreement. If I have all these peers participating in a distributed network and they're exchanging transactions, and those transactions are shared with everybody, assuming that I have security privileges and so on, I can see those transactions. How do I agree that those transactions are valid? Right? Bitcoin will use proof of work. They'll use computational problems, a problem, essentially a guessing game, to try and have people come up to a consensus on transactions as to what's valid, what's not. But does that actually apply when I'm in a permissioned blockchain network where I know my participants? Right? So you'll see proof of work, but you'll also see proof of stake, proof of elapsed time, and other algorithms that can be used to achieve consensus. Right? So that's a big part of the blockchain frameworks, if you will, the blockchain technology. So those are kind of the four key areas. In many ways, I just think of it as a distributed data management platform. Right? You've got data that's shared, distributed network, it's done securely, and potentially with some business logic. You don't need the business logic, but in a lot of the customers that I'm dealing with, the business logic is a key aspect of it. Right? I want to incorporate the notion of smart contracts. I want to bring that ability to automate business transactions across the network. I want to bring that into the blockchain framework. So a lot of it has to do with business logic, doesn't necessarily have to be, but most of the conversations in the enterprise, that tends to be where this kind of falls into place. So in some ways, you can think of it as a distributed data management platform. So you take a bunch of transactions, you add them to a block. That gets replicated out. You're going to have certain participants in the network be responsible for validating those transactions. So whether they're miners, whether they're validators, whether they're going to be, first of all, endorsed, and then after that validated, right? Depending on the blockchain technology that you're using, there'll be different approaches to how you actually validate the transactions in the block. So they validate it, and then they're going to add it to this chain, right? And so essentially you have a block where the cryptographic hash of the previous block is included. And so you end up with every block kind of having a pointer back to the previous block, right? So at the simplest form, that's where the chain part comes into play. So you're linking together these cryptographic hashes such that no one can go in and change previous blocks. Right? That's the idea, because then if they do that, the cryptographic hash is no longer valid. Right? It's a different value. And so I can tell that, okay, someone actually tampered with that part of the chain. And this is normally where the blockchain part comes into play. Right? So they'll make a separation between what the distributed ledger is and what the actual blockchain part is. And it's that linking together backwards of these cryptographic hashes that allows you to form this chain. Right? Otherwise, I can use distributed ledger technologies to do pretty much all the other stuff. Right? Take the data, distribute it, give everyone a copy, and so on. Okay. At the core, this is how it's going to work. And then smart contracts can get added into this mix. So smart contracts allow me to associate and define business logic as part of these transactions. So someone adds a transaction or submits a transaction to the blockchain network, and I can actually have this code run. Maybe it's written in Java, written in Go, written in JavaScript or a JavaScript-like language, and I can actually have this business logic run. And you're doing it by having, again, no central coordinator typically. So in the case of smart contracts, that code can get pushed out to all the peers, and then the peers may all run that code, and then they have to agree on the result before the transaction is actually accepted. Right? So you've got this notion of not just validating the transaction, but also validating the business logic that goes along with that transaction. So a lot of that can be embedded in the blockchain technology itself. So usually you see it developed by the participants in the blockchain in essence, right? Especially when you get into permissioned or consortium blockchains, where a group of people have gotten together and decided what is the business logic that we should execute as part of this interaction. So it's introduced, developers write it, and then add it into the network. Consensus of the parties, yes, yeah. So it's usually, there's a certain consensus mechanism that needs to occur to make sure that everybody agrees that that's what the business logic should be. And there's a consensus on the results of the business logic execution as well. So you've got kind of the two aspects of it. So the development, it's either done by the consortium, like the group. You may have a certain set of peers responsible for the business logic as well. So it can be broken out in different ways in terms of who actually builds it and who owns it. Yeah, well, so there's always the notion of, that's why there has to be some sort of mechanism put into place that everybody agrees on what that logic needs to be. Because otherwise, yeah, you could just change something, right? So yes, yeah. And I mean, the overall goal here is just, it's sort of a better way of doing the old B2B exchanges. Right, so you used to have these B2B exchanges where you would exchange transaction information, purchase orders, whatever it happened to be. This is almost a way to just create a new, better way of creating those networks. Right, so reduce the risk, increase efficiency, automate the execution. Right, it's all about making that logic as seamless as possible across the network. And this is probably where most of the people, at least from the enterprise, are focusing a lot of their time. Yes, there's the security aspects. Yes, there's the how am I going to distribute the data, who can see what, and so on. But the smart contracts is really where it gets interesting. Right, so how can I build business logic into my blockchain environment and use that as a way to automate these business transactions? So what can we do with this? So look at some of the use cases. There's a wide variety of these. There's almost any vertical. There are a set of use cases where blockchain technology can be utilized. And a lot of cases, if I take an example of a supply chain, right? So this could be agricultural products, right? So I've got somebody growing something. Of course, I'm in the wrong state for that, aren't I? Maybe I should rephrase that. Someone growing food, pushing that all the way straight through the consumer. Right? There is the need for tracking where that product came from all the way straight through when it was first created all the way to the end, even if it's just for regulatory requirements. Right? If I need to do a recall, how do I trace that back to the source? Right? So the supply chain is a great example because this could be parts that make up an aircraft engine. This could be raw materials that make up some sort of pharmaceutical drug. There's a number of things here that I may want to track end to end and have visibility into and make sure that it's done securely. No one can went in and actually change the data and so on. But up until now, this is very difficult to achieve because what happens? People have all these integration points into one another, and whether it's done through APIs and so on, and that's up for debate, but they've got all these integration points and they have all their own data sets, and they're trying to bring all the data together, and some of it's out of date, it's out of sync. Somebody can, they own the data, they can kind of accidentally change it, right, without the right governance models put into place and so on. So this becomes a bit of a challenge, right? Getting that end-to-end view in a full supply chain is difficult. So a lot of the conversation is around replacing that with a blockchain network. So if I can have all those participants in the supply chain attached to a blockchain network, and now as key steps, if you will, in the supply chain occur, all of those get recorded on the blockchain. Everybody agreed that happened, and I now have an immutable, auditable log of the entire path throughout the supply chain for all my transactions. Right? So there's an organization that did this for diamonds. They focused on diamonds right from their first either created or dug up, all the way straight through to when they're delivered. I can track the provenance of that asset from beginning to end. Right? And so a lot of the use cases when it comes to blockchain are related to creating this secure end-to-end asset tracking or asset provenance solution. IoT. I'm going to have all these devices. How do I make sure that the device that's joining is actually a valid device? It's a device that I want to have join the network, and that it's a device that is going to participate securely, reliably, and do the right things according to my smart contracts. So there's a lot of work and thought being put into, well, could I have IoT devices now become part of a blockchain ecosystem? And the way in which these devices talk to one another without human intervention could be done through the use of smart contracts. So as an example, if I have solar panels on my house and I want to sell power to my neighbor, why do I have to put the power back into the grid, and the grid does whatever the grid does, and eventually it might make its way back to my neighbor's house? Why can't I just sell it to him directly? And the conditions under which I sell him that power are all managed by these smart contracts. The price, the threshold, how much excess power do I have, what is the time of day, what are the predicted demands on my power consumption going to be, and so on. Right, so there's a lot of this notion of having IoT-triggered smart contracts and using the blockchain network as a way to exchange that information. Now, most of the blockchains, outside of a few exceptions, some proprietary solutions and so on, they're not really designed for high volume. So this is going to have to evolve because, of course, if you attach 1 million devices to this, the volume of information you could potentially have would be quite large. And dealing with this in a few hundred transactions per second is not going to be sufficient. So the technology will have to evolve to match the volumes of data that could be potentially thrown at it. But it's a very interesting concept. Even just using it as a way to actually control who joins when could be interesting. A lot of use cases around just a general notion of identity, even beyond IoT. That could be bad, unless you intend to. You don't like your neighbor, maybe. That could be something like that. But this goes broader, right? This goes into even things like insurance claims. So we did a project where the concept was the car detects that it's in a minor collision. And that signal gets sent to the insurance company. The insurance company knows who you are, they know what policy you have, and they know the conditions under which they can automate payment of the claim. So that is a smart contract that can get executed. And oh, by the way, that smart contract can also notify the authorized repair center to expect your car in for repairs. Right? So there's this kind of network you can create, this ecosystem that is just based on everybody participating in this network. Airline compensation, that's of course, topic for discussion. They know who you are, they know why the plane was late, they could automate compensation. Even renting an apartment, right? I can automate the interaction with the power company, the electricity companies, the gas, the cable, the Netflix, and whoever, right? That could all be automated as part of the network as well. Government, lots of use cases in government. This is interesting because government is one of those ones where, I don't know if they're necessarily always known to be early adopters of new technology, but they seem to have really picked up on this. Dubai, I think, has said that they want to be a blockchain-enabled government completely by 2020. So all the paper that they deal with, whether it's around assets and property sales and licenses and this, that, the other thing. They want to get rid of all of that and have it all blockchain enabled. Right, so very, very aggressive. But there's lots of use cases with government, and so a lot of the work is actually, I get a lot of questions from the government space actually when it comes to the use of this technology. Energy we talked about. Healthcare is another big one. So whether it's actually managing electronic health records, whether it's looking at your own personal health records, provider registries, again, the supply chain around prescription drugs, claims processing, a lot of situations here where I could automate the interaction between multiple parties, right, as part of a business network, and use it as a way to create interactions that are much more seamless, much more efficient, right, and with less risk. Now, where I find a lot of this gets interesting is when you kind of flip this around and make it so that I own my own identity information and I can pick and choose who has access to what. Right? That's a kind of reversal, right? Right now we kind of freely give our information out, social media, and that website has it, that website has it, that website has it. And oh, by the way, I've got to manage my credentials and my identity across all these different websites. Why do I need to do that? Why couldn't I use blockchain technology to manage my identity and then just open it up to the people that need it and put controls around what they can see when? Kind of an interesting, kind of flipping that around. But in essence, you end up with this asynchronous global publishing layer. Some participant on the network pushes a transaction in, all the work happens, it's validated and so on and so forth, but other subscribers, if you will, receive the notification of that transaction and do something on their side that's appropriate to whatever the transaction was. Right? They're decoupled. They don't necessarily know about one another. There's no point-to-point interfaces here. They're just all part of this distributed, decentralized business network. Right? So that is a much more efficient mechanism of dealing with this notion of the digital mesh. Right? How do I interact with it? How do I create these more seamless interactions but in a decentralized fashion? So then there's the technology. Lots of choices out there. I forget the latest count on the number of startups in this space. I don't know if anybody here is from a blockchain startup, but how many would you say there? 700, yeah? Yeah, so there's a number of these companies. So the two kind of major, probably open source flavors, if you will, that most people will talk about, and you let me know if there should be a third or fourth one. There's probably a third, which I'll mention, but Ethereum. Right, that was really, so if you look at it beyond Bitcoin and you look at some of the other technologies, Ethereum is probably the one that people will talk about the most, whether it's actually public Ethereum or whether it's private forks of Ethereum. So there's many different flavors of it, if you will. This is the one that Microsoft will run on the Azure cloud platform to offer it as a service. This is the one that a lot of people will talk about. It's probably one of the main claims to fame, if you will, is really it did introduce this notion of being able to write smart contracts in their environment. So it wasn't just about the transactions, it was about the business logic as well. So they're very, very common. You do run into them a lot. The Hyperledger project be another one that I think that most people would talk about. So you'll have, it's actually underneath the Linux Foundation. You'll have sub-projects like Hyperledger Fabric. You'll have Sawtooth. You'll have Burrow under there and so on. So other flavors, if you will. But this is also a very popular framework that a lot of people will look at. All right, so these are the two that I typically will run into. The other one is R3 Corda. When you look at finance and insurance and the consortium that's been developed around that space, that's probably one of the ones that's, again, the most common. It's an Hyperledger now? Okay. Yeah, there's a debate as to whether it was or wasn't. And okay, so that's good. So it's underneath that umbrella as well. So those are, and this is the one that IBM runs. So we look at the Bluemix platform. This is what they actually run as their blockchain as a service. So it's going to be interesting to see how this evolves. I think Gartner predicted that by I can't remember if it was 2020 or 2025, there's going to be 5 major blockchain platforms. So we're going to go from 700 to 5. I don't know how that happens, but anyway, we'll see. But lots of opportunity. Even Disney created one. I'm trying to remember, Dragon something. I got to look it up and see what it is. But they actually released one and open sourced it as well.
So what are the implications of the no-build cryptocurrency tokens?
So there you're not really dealing with money, currency. You can add your own, but you're now more focused on the transactions. Hyperledger Fabric really came from the idea that we are going to be playing in the permissioned blockchain space, right? We're gearing towards the enterprise. And they don't really tend to be that interested in creating their own tokens, right? Not like a Bitcoin or even Ether on the Ethereum network. So they're more concerned around smart contracts and how do we make this applicable to permissioned blockchain networks.
Do they use proof of work for validation?
So they, depends on the flavor, I guess. So for example, Sawtooth Lake will use proof of elapsed time because it's actually based on some of the Intel SGX security hardware solutions that they've got. So it'll depend on which flavor under the Hyperledger project you're looking at. The goal there was to make it pluggable, so you could actually add your own, depending on what you need for your particular environment. Okay, just a couple more thoughts. Then I always get the question of, oh, this is great. I can put a blockchain technology in. This is, it's going to solve everything that I need to do. And then they start asking questions. Well, how do I get data from my enterprise systems, databases, ERP systems, whatever that happens to be, mainframes? How do I get data into the blockchain? How do I get data out of the blockchain? It's like, oh, yeah, I have to kind of figure that out. I have smart contract logic, business logic in my blockchain. But how do I make sure that that kind of nicely extends into my enterprise systems? Because I'm not going to put all my business logic in a blockchain. So that has to kind of match up with what I've got outside. So how do I do that? I want to make things kind of event-driven. I'm not going to keep asking the blockchain, is there any new transactions for me? Any new transactions for me? I'm not going to keep doing that. I just want it to tell me. Right? So I'm going to set up kind of this notification event-driven framework around it. If I've got all this data in a distributed ledger, how can I see it? How can I analyze it? I've got all these transactions. I've got this entire supply chain. Again, given security requirements and so on. How do I analyze it? How do I even do things like SLA measuring, right, of all the transactions that are in there? How do I know how it's performing, all the participants? What do I do? And then, am I just going to open this up to everybody? No, probably not. So I'm going to need to provide some sort of managed layer that sits on top of that blockchain technology so that other developers can write against it and use APIs and so on. So I need to kind of have a managed API framework around this. So a lot of cases when I'm talking to enterprises around, well, how do I incorporate blockchain technology into my enterprise architecture? These are the kind of questions that they're asking. So there's a flavor of this. And so there's many different ways you can draw these diagrams, right? So this is just one picture. So normally you'll start with a blockchain technology at the bottom. It's going to provide a set of low-level APIs, whether that's done through the Hyperledger Fabric client, SDK, or Node.js, or Web3, or REST, or JSON, or whatever it is. I'm going to have this set of low-level APIs, but then I may layer capabilities on top. So I may want to define microservices around these APIs, whether they're lower-level system services or whether they're higher-level bounded business contexts. Right? I'm going to want to put API management on top of that. Right? So I'm going to control who can have access to those APIs. I'm going to want to identify who's using what API. I'm going to create event handlers. I'm going to define my smart contracts, maybe using things like business rules. So how can I do that? And then I may create a decoupling between the blockchain technology itself and the enterprise applications. Because I don't want to have a bunch of point-to-point connections now to this blockchain peer. I want to decouple it. So they should be able to publish data to the blockchain and subscribe to data from the blockchain, but not actually have to talk directly to the underlying framework. Right? Just some of the best practices around systems design. And then I need to decide, well, what am I going to do on-chain versus off-chain? Am I going to store all the data on-chain, or am I going to actually have some of it stored off-chain? And if I'm going to do that, what are the security implications of doing so? Okay, so there's different pictures of this. For anybody interested, there's a white paper that talks about this, and you can go to our booth, which is right next door here, and give us your email, and we'll send you a copy of it. But these are just some of the things that, again, enterprise architects need to look at. So last couple of slides. Not every problem requires a blockchain, just like everything else, right? We have to pick and choose what actually makes sense. You need to look at the number of network participants. If I only have 2 people in my business network, am I going to need a blockchain technology to do that? Probably not, right? There's other ways that I can do this. I need to look at how much trust, how much integrity I need in my system, the amount of data that I'm going to store, performance requirements. Do I have business transactions that I need to automate? Right? These are all going to all help you decide, do I need a blockchain? And they're also going to help you decide which one do I want to play with. But play with it, right? It's the only way in which you can learn is to actually take a use case, see if there's a business value that could potentially be associated by bringing in a blockchain technology for that use case, stand it up in the lab, try it out. Right? This is where a lot of the executive teams and that I also present to, the general recommendation is that you do need to be aware of this. You may not have a use case for it right now, but you definitely need to be aware of it. It doesn't look like this is going to be one of those things that just kind of is there and then isn't, right? This is a technology that potentially could be around for quite some time. So play with it, look at the use cases, and see what characteristics are going to match what you need to do. And with that, I talked about the meetup. People want to go to either Berlin or San Diego. That's where we have our user conference. You can learn a lot more about this. And questions, I'll actually be around in our booth here, right, or our table right next door. So I'm happy to stick around after that for questions as well. Okay, thank you.